I think it's incumbent upon me as a public servant to use my power, to use my skills, to use my experiences to create worlds in which there are infinite possibilities. Because otherwise, why am I here? I don't see my being in any other way other than to create infinite possibilities and for us to attend to what we might describe as this civic imagination. Imagination gives us the ability to go beyond what's in front of us and to dream a different way of being and a different way of seeing the world. And I think it's incumbent upon me to do that all the time, all the time.
Hello and welcome. I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Nana Bonsu as we take a communication perspective on children, stories, and communities. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that by using a communication perspective, we can reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Nana Bonsu. Nana is the Director of Relational Practice in Camden as of earlier this year. She has worked in children's services for over 20 years, both in children's statutory services and children, adolescent, and mental health services. Nana is an experienced lecturer and has written several publications. You can read more about her in the show notes, but you'll also get to know her in our conversation today. This is the fourth episode in our relationships series, and this time we're talking about relationships with children and families and communities. If you're anything like me, then I think you'll fall in love with Nana right away in this conversation and definitely learn a thing or two from her as well. Before we jump in, I also want to ask for your help. I'm beginning to think about the next season of the podcast, and if you've been a listener for some time now, you will have noticed that my approach and format has changed over the past couple of years, and that's because each year I'm reflecting and learning and making new choices about what works and what's meaningful. And that's something that I want your help figuring out. So I'd love to invite you to fill out the survey that I've linked in the show notes so you can truly help me co-create this podcast to be what you want it to be. Again, you can find that link in the show notes, and I appreciate you for participating. Now let's continue the conversation with Nana. Hi, Nana. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Hi, Abby. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I am really looking forward to getting to speak with you, especially since you were recommended as a conversation partner to me by Barbara McKay, who I adore and think so highly of. So I imagine that we are going to have an amazing conversation today.
Thank
To get
you.
us started, can you introduce yourself and, feel free to do the kind of work bio, because I know we'll talk a lot about your
Sure.
work today too, but I also love to know more about you as a person. So share
Yeah.
whatever stories or context feels relevant and meaningful for you.
Okay. Thanks, Abby. So, as you stated, my name is Nana Bonsu. I'm a qualified social worker, family therapist, and systemic supervisor. I've been working in children's services and child adolescent mental health services for over 20 years now. And I've been really fortunate to use my dual qualification as a senior leader in a number of London local authorities to developing service design and innovation around systemic practice. So, using systemic practice in a way to think about relationships, think about embedding systemic ideas in workforce and supporting colleagues in the workforce to use those ideas as a way of engaging, holding in mind matters around context, holding in mind matters around power and difference, and also attending to self-reflexivity, because the work that we do can be quite challenging and emotionally demanding. So I think it's important that a workforce is resilient and robust to manage and deal with some of the things that we have to encounter. And I've been really in my career very much thinking about possibilities and going against orthodoxy. So, going against what we know to be true in terms of service delivery and design, and rethinking and redeveloping ideas around what practice can look like. So, that is really important to me. My background, my family are immigrants. So, my parents came to England in the 70s. So my parents are from Ghana in West Africa. And I know what it's like, if you like, to be raised in this kind of dual way. So having very strong Ghanaian cultural references in my family of origin and my home, but also attending to a very kind of British culture, but a culture that was mixed with communities from other immigrant populations. So I think at an early age, I learned um, how to navigate different spaces and draw upon different ways of being in order to fit in and to what we might describe as assimilate. And I also experienced what it is to be othered and to be
Mm.
treated differently, because my name, Nana Bonsu, when I was growing up, was very uncommon. And so I understood and experienced what it's like to be othered. So those personal experiences have come forth in my senior leadership style, and it's galvanized me to think about how I attend to difference, how I attend to social justice, and how I use authenticity as a way of being, and trying to always attend to children and families at the heart of everything that I do. So that's a way of introduction.
Yes, that's a great place to start, and reminds me that last time we spoke, you mentioned that you see your kind of personal and professional lives as being very connected. So I'm curious if you could say a little
Yeah,
more about that in terms of maybe how experiences in your own life led you to do the work that you do, and then maybe also
yeah.
now, how does it inform your approach to your work?
Yeah. So I think when I think back about my experiences of being with people, I think about some key points. So one being my mum, who owned a hairdressing shop, and she owned a hairdressing shop at a time in an area that was quite white and working class. It's very different now, but she was only the second black hairdressing shop in the area. And what I learned as a child, going to the shop on a Saturday, making tea for women, combing hair and sweeping the floor, is that there were women in that shop who came from a range of backgrounds and diversity, and they were women who were going through different experiences. So, whether that would be illness such as cancer, whether that would be secrets,
Mm,
whether that would be employment issues, whether that be raising children perhaps on their own or in a configuration with extended family members. But I saw different types of women, but what they all had was an ability to, despite their circumstances, find a way. And my mum was a very, and is still a very influential person on me, in that when she opened up her shop at the time, as a woman, she couldn't get a loan from the bank, and she wanted my dad to sign some documentation for her to get the loan to have the shop, and he didn't think it was a good business idea. So she asked an uncle of mine to pretend to be her husband, and that's how she got the loan, which I
wow.
think is genius, right?
Yeah.
And I think from an early age, I watched people, and I learned how to read people, and I learned that we all are trying our very best, and
Mm,
we're all trying, despite the circumstances we may find ourselves, find a way. And I also saw what it was to belong. That there was something about my mum's shop which was like a community.
yeah.
People came there, I saw, and they sought counsel from my mum. They sought advice from my mum.
Mm,
There was a sense of community in that people had various skills. So somebody would was good at baking would be connected with somebody. Somebody who knew an electrician would be connected with somebody. It became a way of serving the community, actually, more than just getting your hair done. There was something about my mum's shop that taught me a great deal about how we can serve each other and we can help each other. So I think that has been pivotal in my understanding of resilience and overcoming the circumstances you may find yourself in, and being able to go beyond what people think you're capable of.
Mhm.
And that's a really important thing for me when I think about how I support colleagues who I manage or supervise, to support them to think that you can go beyond what you think is possible for yourself and for the service. And for children that I work with, where there may be quite pathologizing narratives, discourses about them, it's really important for me to be able to talk to and talk into a different way, a different narrative, and privileged, subjugated stories,
Mhm.
because otherwise I think we become quite narrow and quite hopeless. And I think hopefulness is a key part of my passion and my desire to feel that I have the capacity and the ability to change things. And I think, as I said, my mum being a role model in going against what people said she could do in terms of you can't get a loan, you're a woman,
Mhm.
and also going against what people thought as a black woman at that time, having her own business, she circumnavigate and found a way. And that's been a very strong ethos of mine in my leadership.
I'm so glad that this is kind of the path you're setting us down for this conversation, because it's hitting on something I've kind of more recently been playing around with, and that is kind of stories as power. This idea
Yeah,
that I truly think the more stories you hear, the more maybe
yeah,
diverse stories you hear, the more I'll make the jump and say the more hope that you have, because I
yeah,
think that allows your imagination to be so
yeah,
much more expansive, what you can imagine for yourself.
yeah,
And maybe especially young, like you said, you were in a number of communities where you were hearing a number of different stories. And so that exposure maybe
yeah,
gave you early on, maybe earlier than other people experience, a kind of understanding that a collection of stories, very different stories, can coexist at once,
yes, yes.
and see
That's
that
right.
there's many paths and there's many possibilities.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I think that's really incredible and powerful then to say, do that kind of reflecting work and say, okay, what did I happen to learn by the circumstances? And then going forward, how can I kind of intentionally
yeah,
bring that to other children's life, to say there's
yeah,
many stories. And I know you talk about meaning making, and that's such important language for the
yeah,
CMM theory and what it
yeah,
really means. To me, especially, that's what's at the heart of what it means to have a communication perspective, that you're saying in the communicating we do, we're making meaning,
yeah,
and that gives us power, and that gives us choice. And that
yeah,
means there's a need for us to do this communicating and collaborating in this way, because we have to create the meaning in relationships. So I'm curious about, I kind of, overlaid that like story language over what you just
yeah,
shared, because
yeah,
that's the lens that I'm seeing. So I wonder if you could speak more to the kind of meaning making that happens in your
yeah.
work.
Yeah, I guess when I'm thinking about the context that I'm in, Abby, that attends to risk, that attends to safety, that attends to often these dual ways of thinking,
Mhm.
which is framed in statute, which is not necessarily helpful. So when I say that, I think about, within a children's services context, the language that's often used is children in need and children at risk, and this kind of binary way of viewing what I believe is humanity and complexity, and trying to, which I can understand why, trying to simplify and then trying to ascertain, well, what services is
Mhm.
required based on, is it need, is it safeguarding, is it protection? But I think the meaning that is created then becomes somewhat problematic, because it fails to see that we are on a continuum in terms of how we engage in the world and how our experiences are formed by the context that we're in. It isn't an easy matter of just trying to ascertain that you are in need or you're safeguarding. At any given time, any of us can experience very significant challenges that can lead us to make decisions that are not necessarily the best ones. But I think also within that meaning making is the inherent stories that one can tell oneself about what is possible, and then how one is positioned by others about what is possible.
Hmm.
So the reason I say that, as a child, raised in what I would describe as a working class community, I remember when a teacher said to me, "Oh, when I was at secondary school, high school for you guys, when you go to university." And I remember kind of looking behind me thinking, who's he talking to? It hadn't even occurred to me that I would
Mm.
go to university, because as I said, family's been immigrants. That university was not part of our discourse. Education was, but not university. And therefore, I started to hear and think about this idea about university. It was almost a seed had been planted, and it started to grow. And then I started to think, oh, okay, maybe I could go to university. Maybe I could try and think about myself in that way. What would that look like? What would it take? And then the curiosity began to grow from there. And, I was able to do that of several times over. But what that has taught me is that if one is given a narrative and a discourse, you can live into it and not out of it. And there's something about how we support and legitimize a number and a range of multiple perspectives, which is why systemic psychotherapy is so dear to me, in that it is an expansive way of viewing the world. And it's a way of thinking about the world in more possibilities and hopefulness than
Mhm.
just risk, worry, safety, because that is not the sum total of people's lived experiences. They are more than that. And when I've worked with families and children who I think are incredible human beings, I see every day matters and experiences that one ought to think, how are you still here? How is it that you are still here after all that you've been through? And that lends itself to me knowing that there is so much more that people don't see, or they choose not to see, and they choose to privilege other narratives and stories, which are very limiting and damaging. So part of my work is trying to get service design and delivery to plant a seed, as I was given a seed, and give children a sense of themselves which is greater than what they've been told thus far, and give them an opportunity to experience a side of themselves which might be a subjugated or a shy story, in order for them to orientate themselves in a way, and for others to see them orientating in a different way. And that's so important. So an example I can give you is um, supporting young people to engage in a program we've done in Wandsworth with Apple. So Apple, the company, and recognizing that there are children who, for whatever reason, are not in mainstream education, but they are gifted and talented in their own right. And so Apple agreeing with senior leaders in Wandsworth to develop a program, an 8-week program for children who are not in mainstream school, but giving them the tools and experiences to use apps to create films, short stories, music, what have you, and helping them and helping others to think, wow, who knew that was inside you? Who knew there was a script inside you? Who knew there was a photographer inside you? And actually, I see young people who are very talented, um, but it's not necessarily been harnessed in a way that I think enables there to be a different narrative about them. So that's important to me in my work.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're going to tell stories about ourselves. We're going to internalize stories about ourselves one way or the other. So if you can like speak a new story into kids, like the program that you've done with Apple, like a lot of your work, if you can say, okay, yes, we're working with children who are deemed at risk by
Yeah,
the system, that have maybe experienced trauma, but that's not the singular story about them. If you
yeah,
can offer them other stories, the kind of visual or metaphor that's coming to my mind is if they're, because you talk about, planting seeds, if they're sitting in their little patch of dirt and there's one single
yeah,
seed has been planted, one story's been
yeah,
told, then all they know is to nurse and take care of and focus all their attention on that
yeah,
flower that's blossoming, that
yeah,
story that's growing and growing for them.
yeah,
If you can kind of scatter more seeds around them,
yeah,
give them
that's right.
more options of stories,
Yeah,
then they have a whole garden and get to see
yeah,
themselves, maybe that
yeah,
importantly, how you see yourself.
yeah,
Because I think we tell ourselves stories and then also other people tell us stories about us,
that's right.
and that all
That's
shapes how
right.
we see ourselves. So if you can see
Yeah,
yourself not as a singular story or a singular flower, but
yeah,
as the entire garden with the many, colorful flowers or whatever plants
exactly.
might be growing.
And then in that way you can make choices, because in that way
Right.
then you're able to step outside of whatever it is people assume you can or cannot do, and begin to have some sense of authenticity for yourself. So when I think about my journey as a senior leader, and the story that I used to tell myself about, gosh, I can't possibly be in that space, I can't possibly do that, I realized that that was a redundant story and it wasn't true. But it took a while for me to begin to accept the story of myself around my ability to do things and my ability to do it well, and
Mm,
almost inhabit that story in a way that made me feel comfortable. And I think that's a legacy of the damage of singular narratives on the lives of people that
yeah.
are living in a way that they don't feel that they're capable of doing something, because they have been socialized into believing that. And I that's ethically immoral to me. And
Mhm.
I think it's incumbent upon me as a public servant to use my power, to use my skills, to use my experiences to create worlds in which there are infinite possibilities. Because otherwise, why am I here? I don't see my being in any other way other than to create infinite possibilities, and for us to attend to what we might describe as this civic imagination. Imagination gives us the ability to go beyond what's in front of us and to dream a different way of being and a different way of seeing the world. And I think it's incumbent upon me to do that all the time, all the time.
It's interesting to me thinking back to this, wanting to approach this conversation using a communication perspective. I guess I'm kind of seeing us being able to do that in two ways. One being, how do you communicate about your work? So I'm already getting some of that language that you use around the stories and the meaning making and the approach that you have. And then also, I'm curious about how you communicate within your work. What does that look
Yeah,
like? Because
yeah,
I've mentioned to you before that the CMM theory speaks to what it looks like for two adults to communicate together. It doesn't
yeah,
explicitly say that, but that's what it's speaking to, assuming that both people are, maybe fully conscious, capable adults who have, lived stories and maybe have this deeper capacity for understanding at the level of the theory. And so I'm curious, how can, some of these great pieces of a communication perspective be applied to relationships, to communication with children? I
yeah,
know, you work with a maybe specific group of children,
yeah,
but maybe also children in general. So I'm curious what you can
yeah.
say about maybe what you've learned through your work about, I guess, what works and what is meaningful in your
Yeah,
communication with children.
I think when I think about that question, I think with children, but with networks around children. So when
Yeah.
I think about with children, I use humor a lot, and then I pay attention to difference. So a difference might be something that is not being talked about incessantly, perhaps around risk. A young girl that I was remember visiting at her home. She wanted me to plait her hair, and we were sitting down plaiting her hair, and I was talking about, you know, how clever she is, and how bright she is, and you know, again planting genuinely. I genuinely believe it. It's not a disingenuous act. It's a genuine act around the matters that I see that you are doing exceedingly well. And my gosh, that's incredible that you're gifted in this particular thing, or that hadn't occurred to me. Wow, how did you do that? Tell me a bit more. So, showing a level of curiosity with children, showing a level of appreciation of their lived experiences and their expertise, that's really important to me. So, understanding, for instance, we had a kind of a focus group session with some young people around how they navigate their safety in the community using public transport. And we had the British Transport Police in the focus group, and one young girl, to on the bus, if there's an incident, she takes a picture on the buses. It will have a license and serial number, so she would take a picture of that. So when she's reporting what happened, the CCTV control kind of room will be able to ascertain which bus, which route. And I said, wow, that had never occurred to me to do that. That is so clever. That is so talented. So honoring and privileging what children do to exist in their world and how they go about their business, I think is an important way for me to communicate and make meaning of their lived experiences without focusing solely on risk and worries, because that is there. We know that's there, but there's
Yeah.
also other things there. So I would say that about when I think about networks, I deliberately use language like these are our children. These are our children. This is our responsibility. We have to do better, because I know that othering can then position people around thinking that that's not my problem, that's their problem, or that's a particular community's problem. It's not a whole community problem. And in my view, every experience that children have, we're all connected to it. Everyone's connected to the lives of children. And so I would deliberately use that language as a way of bringing colleagues alongside me in a way that shows an appreciation and a level of humanity to what we're having to deal with. Because it's very easy, Abby, to become organized by information that's recorded, and problems that you fail to see the child behind it, and you become kind of removed from the child and pay attention to the problem. So humanizing children in spaces and places where they're not there, and often the tendency when the child is not there is that language can be quite blaming and pathologizing. So really trying my best to hold the child in mind and bring to everybody's attention the trauma a child may experience, that the child's behavior is actually logical given what they've gone through. And actually, I don't know how they're even going to school, even if it's one day a week. My God, isn't that amazing and incredible given all they've gone through? So, really trying to deliberately and intentionally use language as a intervention in its own right when I'm in those kind of spaces and places.
I'm racking my brain trying to think of who I need to attribute this to, but I've had so many conversations, sometimes they all blend together. But another person I've spoken with said their perspective is that you are a human and everything else is a story. So
Yeah,
that is what I'm kind of reminding me of as you talk about this humanizing element being so important. And yes, if we can just focus on you are a human being first and everything else is a story, not to say that everything else is not meaningful, not to belittle it,
yeah,
but again, to
yeah,
get to that piece of like, it's one story of many, and also
yeah,
different meaning can be made of
yeah,
those stories if you feel
yeah,
empowered to do so.
yeah,
And yeah, I was just thinking about that as you talk about that kind of non-pathologizing piece. It feels so important. Can you speak to
yeah.
that a little more?
Yeah, I think, when I think about, an experience that any of us go through is an experience in that time. It's not the sum total of who you will be. And I think there's something about being able to hold the here and now. So, the work that I do has to attend to risk, it has to attend to safety, and that's right and that's proper. So it's not being forthright, but it's also appreciating that that child will grow up to be an adult. And we have no idea, CMM, stories lived, stories told, untold stories. We have no idea what that adult will be and who will they be, and we have no idea about the mystery of life in terms of where they will go and what that will look like. So there's something about how to hold on to the challenges of the here and now, but hold on to this idea that everything is temporary and nothing remains the same forever, and that there will be a moment in time where this will look different. And if we can, in some way, I think in my work, facilitate a capacity to hold on and literally hold on, because there are moments of real decision making where you have to be very courageous and very brave and hold on. If we can hold on, and if everybody can hold on, we can then begin to think about, well, what else can we create and develop and think about in order to secure the safety of this child, and without having to feel that all is lost, because that's the tragedy of being able not to think in a hopeful way, because then why, I shouldn't get up every morning if I think that, and I think as that's not possible to do that in my view. And I think as well, when I think about the way in which service design and delivery, this relational way of being is fundamental to that, because I've seen directly how relationships are a conduit for change, and how relationships can create the safety in which young people can explore, sides of themselves that they didn't know that they had. But it's through the relationship, that secure base, attachment theory that we were taught to, that enables that to happen. But that safety can also be transmitted through communities. And I've seen the power of communities contributing in a way to think about a collective way of responding to an issue or a matter. So moving away from these kind of Western notions about family configuration to thinking more broadly. Because again, if I go back to a personal reference, when I was growing up as a child, my parents worked and I was looked after by my childminder, who I refer to as Nanny. And I knew Nanny from the age of 3, and sadly, last year she passed away. But Nanny's home was one in which every child on that estate knew, and every child would go there and have something to eat. She fed everyone, she was a cook. And so she would do cooking for the school and cooking for weddings and parties and so on. And on that estate, there was a lady called Pat, a woman who ran the youth centre, and Pat knew every single child by their name. And this is a huge estate. And I saw the power of communities contributing to the lives of children. It's an estate where you would go to the sweet shop and get your sweets, and the people in the sweet shop knew all of us by name. They knew who we were connected to. They knew us intimately. And that is a different way of being to just being cared for by a single carer or two carers. We were cared for by everybody on that community in that estate, and eh, we were children, so we would do things that we shouldn't be doing. By the time we got home, Nanny knew what we were doing. It's like, wow, this is scary. Like, it
Yeah.
was like, you guys have been seeing, you're playing by the railway track, and we'd be like, God, how does she know this? She's at home. How does she know? But there was this way of being part of something that it's like a community that didn't need to have a formal way of being told that you're a community.
Mm.
They inherently knew how to look after each other, and they inherently understood that child caring and child rearing was the responsibility of all the adults around those children. And again, there's something for me really quite powerful about how we enter into an understanding of what is possible rather than believing that that is some kind of utopia that can't happen.
Mhm.
I believe strongly that we all have the capacity to be humane and relational to each other in order to create the social worlds that we wish to see. But it has to be intentional, it has to be with authenticity. But it is possible because I'm a child of that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, this kind of taking theory to practice piece is so central to me. And I realize I've said before, and I'm thinking it again now, that some of my favorite people to talk to, or at least some of the kind of most natural conversations I've had, have been with people who are therapists or social workers or have that kind of psychology background. Cause I think that's a shared goal, is that turning that theory into practice.
Yeah,
And so everything you just shared is making me think, what does the practice look like for children, for adults who exist in communities that don't just naturally get it, like the community
yeah,
you experience seem to? I'm curious how you kind of teach that, or how you kind of invite the children's support system, their networks, into that. I don't know if you
yeah,
have like an example or a story where you
yeah,
could kind of speak to
yeah,
what does that practically look
yeah.
like for people to try to intentionally build when it's not naturally there.
Yeah, I think in my experience in local authorities that have develop systemic practice, one has to have what I call a whole system approach to design and delivery. And when I say a whole system, that means everybody in the organization has to have guiding principles, which is the framework for their vision and values for an organization. And that has to include senior leaders, it has to include middle managers, frontline practitioners. Everybody has to speak the same language and act accordingly. And what I've seen in my experience in local authorities, in Croydon and in Wandsworth, is very much a practice framework, a way in which to hook our ideas and values, which provide the frame in which to act into. So, the practice frameworks typically have been around that we are relational, that we are systemic, that we hold to a multiple perspective, that we attend to matters around anti racism and power and difference. And we recognize that the best place for a child to thrive and be is with their family. And so when you have that as your vision that you set out for everybody to buy into, you then develop the infrastructure in which that can show itself. So in local authorities, I've been in one way of bringing in systemic ideas around hypothesizing and multiple perspectives is group supervision. Recognizing that that dyadic nature of a manager and a practitioner may be limited in terms of its scope, and that there can at times be this lack of curiosity and difference.
Mm.
So, by having a group of practitioners discussing and thinking and bringing ideas and holding each other in a way that recognizes that vulnerability and emotionality is part of the work that we do, and it's legitimate to talk about it. It's legitimate to bring your personal and professional self into your practice. And those infrastructures also around, I've been responsible for recruiting family therapists and making them part and parcel of the practice system. So they contribute to the thinking, they contribute to the learning, and they are able to offer families direct clinical interventions without families needing a diagnosis, without families having to go to, a clinical or treatment center that might be far away from where they live. It might only open from 9 to 5. It might not appreciate and recognize the challenges of poverty and not being able to get somewhere, or the challenges of mental health, or additional needs that make it hard to get to a place of treatment. So devising and deliberately developing clinical practice that is bespoke, is community-based, is collaborative, and attends to co-production and co-design is something that I have seen transform cultural practice, and I have seen it have good outcomes. I've been in local authorities where we have a regulator called Ofsted that checks that the work that we do is satisfactory and meets the needs of children, and children's needs are being met. I've been in local authorities where the Ofsted regulator judgment was inadequate and it became good, or it was requires improvement and it became good. And those systems, systemic systems, have been a part and influence of shaping and delivering those outcomes in that way. So I know that these ideas cannot just be done in a vacuum. They cannot just be at the behest of one or two people. It needs a whole conviction from an organization. And as I said, it has to be the way we see the world and how we wish to be in the world. And that takes courage and it takes authenticity. But I know that it works because I've seen it.
Yeah, that systems thinking approach that's kind of a new idea to me that I've heard in a couple other spaces recently, and it feels really important. It kind of makes me think of the idea of, intersectionality and approaching
Yeah,
injustices in the world through an intersectional lens, to acknowledge
yeah,
that they're all related. And so that practice of zooming out, which is how
yeah,
I'm kind of characterizing a systems thinking, is, yeah, to
yeah,
truly see it as a system, see
yeah,
yourself as part of a larger system too.
yeah,
I appreciate all of that explanation. And one way I'm thinking about it is that you kind of just described to us the path. And I
mm,
would be curious to hear how you describe the destination. Maybe it's something you're always
yeah,
working towards,
yeah,
but the destination in terms of, in CMM, we use this language of better social worlds, and
yeah,
that's the
that's
destination.
right.
That's what we're working
Yeah,
towards. And it's
yeah.
helpful to try to define, or at least kind of, think through, reflect on how you
What
would
would that look
define a
like?
better social, right? So
Yeah,
then it informs how
yeah,
you act now. So you can say, if
yeah,
that's the goal, how would
yeah,
I act now, as if
yeah,
I truly thought that that was a possible
yeah,
place? I know
yeah,
some of the language, and this I'm pulling from the bio that's on the Institute of Family Therapy website, but some of the language that's just right in your bio, and you can tell me if this is, maybe there's
yeah,
different words that you use now, but the safe dialogical spaces is language
yeah,
that really stuck out to me. So I don't know if you use different language now, or if you can speak to what that means. But yeah, can you kind of describe, now that we know the
yeah,
path, what's the destination? What's your hope? What is your better social world for
yeah,
these children and for their
yeah.
support systems?
That's a really good question because then you work backwards from that. And I think for me, there's definitely something around flattening the hierarchy. And
Mm,
there's definitely something about how we work in a way that just facilitates and supports change, but we are not the behest of that. That the families and the children are experts in their lives and their experiences. They live their lives day in, day out.
right.
We just come along for a moment in time and hopefully be able to, as I said, create expansion or repositioning or navigation. But definitely this notion for me around a world in which people have self-efficacy and autonomy to make decisions for themselves, a world in which children are not being exploited because of poverty or because of lack of opportunities within school settings, a world in which any child belongs to us all. So if I'm walking down the road and I see a child in distress, or I see something that doesn't look right, I don't walk past, I attend to it. A world in which no matter who you engage with, particularly if you work it within, in the public sector, that families will be treated with a level of respect and love and kindness that doesn't prevent them from being able to develop trusted relationships with people when they're at their most vulnerable. A world in which we can attend to the needs of each other in a way with respect and humility, and that we can see that we are all the same, really. We are all trying our best to do the best that we can. And that there shouldn't be a um, sense of real kind of shame and blame attributed to matters that are there because of inequality and poverty and a lack of social justice,
Mhm.
so that we revolutionize the way in which we understand that families are a product of the society that they're in, and rather than blame families, we do it consciously and unconsciously. We look at the society and say that that's where it's got to change, because if we don't attend to that, people will continually be harmed. If we don't attend to that, we will continually see the presentations that we see. So that is where I know that we can get to, and I know there are local authorities all over the country in the UK who do that and do their best to do that. But I think we need to do more of it, and I think we need to demonstrate through sharing of practice and sharing of ideas. How do we do these things? How can we support each other? Move away from competitive thinking, move away from ideas that sees, you know, oh, that local authority over there, they're doing better than this local authority over here. We are all working to meet the needs of vulnerable children or parents or adults. Therefore, it's incumbent on all of us to share and to move these boundaries that we have, because they're artificial and they're man-made, and they lead to, I think, ideas around we're better than you, you're not as good as us. And that's not what we should be doing. We should be serving children by serving each other and contributing to the learning of us all. Again, I know that happens, but I don't think we do it enough.
Yeah, maybe not with enough intentionality or mindfulness
Yeah,
behind it to
yeah,
make it feel really purposeful and meaningful. Yeah.
yeah. I think we could do a lot more of that. And so I know when I've ran a conference for a couple of years called Beyond Boundaries, and the intention of that was to bring out those who practice as family therapists or use systemic practice in their organization, but move away from I work in, Croydon, you work in Newham, you work in Wandsworth, or, these London local authorities, that mean that we don't necessarily see how we are connected. So
Mhm.
my intention of that conference was to kind of be really clear. We are all doing this work. We are all attending to supporting and serving others. How can we continue to do it collectively and do it in a way that is from a place of generosity and a place of expansiveness? So that's something that I'm really interested in, is
Mhm.
how develop these large scale ways of thinking across and between, and not just locating ideas within just one artificial boundary.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so clear to me, to hear the systems thinking perspective and what you're saying. And I don't know who used this analogy first, but I've referenced it before. It's that there's some work where, you can be pulling people out of the river and saving them for as long
Mm,
as you want, but at some point you have to go upriver and say, who's
yes, that's right.
throwing these people in the river, or where's the
Yeah,
bridge broken that people keep falling in
yeah,
the river? That's that kind of, maybe the design you referred to earlier, the system, not just systems thinking, but systems design. How are we
yeah,
establishing and designing our uh, communities, our
yeah,
societies,
that's right.
our support systems, so that people aren't quote unquote falling in the river, and so there's
Yeah,
maybe like a need
that's
on
right.
both ends. Is that
Yeah,
the work that, when you work with families that already have experienced trauma or violence, kids that are at risk, that's pulling people out of the river. And then for all those
Yeah.
future kids and
Yeah.
families, we
Yeah.
also, as a
Have
collective,
to
like you're
attend to
saying,
the
need to
system.
work
Yeah.
together to
Yeah.
move
100%.
upstream and
Yeah.
address the issue that's at the root of it.
That's right. Yeah. Because otherwise, for me, we continue to replicate
Yeah.
patterns that are not helpful and that don't serve us. And if we work with families, we'll be the first to say something to the effect of, why do you keep doing that every time he comes home at 6? Because it always results in an argument. Why do you keep doing the same thing? And we need to ask that about the systems that are designed around us. Why do we continue to have systems
Mm.
when we know that they're failing and they're not working? So it's that level of thinking that is really important for me. And in this new role that I'll be in Camden as the Director of Relational Practice, that will be really important for me to begin to think in that more strategic whole systems approach to service design and delivery, and this notion that no matter where or who a family or child encounters, they will experience humane relational love and respect, regardless of their circumstances.
Yeah, one of the questions I'm coming back to as we kind of wrap up this conversation is that, it seems important for you to acknowledge that whatever trauma a child or a family has experienced, it's not the only story.
No.
But also the truth is that you're interacting with these families and children in the first place because the trauma they've
Mm,
existed, real trauma, have experienced inequity, or there's, unbalanced power dynamics at play
that's
that are
right.
unhealthy. And
Yeah.
so I'm just curious, I guess maybe this is again like okay, well, what does it look like practically speaking question to say that, yes, you are trying to speak in these new other stories, but also acknowledging the real context that you are speaking into for a lot of these families.
Yeah.
How do you kind of
Yeah.
balance maybe the not diminishing the reality of the trauma, but also
Yeah.
trying to offer new stories?
Yeah. I think that's something that I'm still working out in my head
Mm,
because I oscillate between the context plays a part and the individual in that context is a part of that experience, but that's not the sum total of them. And the reason why I say I'm oscillating is because if you like, in a way, I embody that within myself. So, I was raised, like I said, immigrant family, raised on a council estate, the first person in my family to go to university, not kind of thinking I would be where I am today, but yet I am here today. So there is something of both and, which is a systemic term, that has lent me to believe that both things are there, but they also, the person that I am today and speaking to you today has been informed and shaped by those experiences as well. And they have created the leader that I am, and they've created the services that I've designed and the things that I think about. So, not to say that, I haven't shared many things about the things that I've gone through, which have been hard and difficult, not to say that they were right and I shouldn't have gone through them, but also to say it's because of them that I am in these places and spaces, and it is because of them that I speak in the way that I do, and I hold colleagues and services to account, and I keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for better. So it's something that I'm still trying to make sense of, Abby, actually, because I've got two sons, two black boys, and I want them to feel that they can do anything, that anything is possible, that there are no limits. But I also know there's a context to being a black boy in discourses and narratives that are problematizing and pathologizing. So it's something that I'm still trying to work out, but I know that the stories that I was told as a child had a huge impact on me in many ways. On one hand, my parents telling me, you've got to work 100 times harder because you're black and because your parents are from Ghana and what they went through of being, racial trauma. Um, so on the one hand, being told that, and then being working hard, working hard, working hard, working hard, and then feeling like I haven't done enough. I still need to do more. I haven't done enough. So the legacy of that story, whilst the intentionality was one of trying to support and help me, has also been something that has stopped me recognizing, oh, I've done pretty well actually. I've held on to, I haven't done enough. I haven't done enough. I need to do more. So can you see where on one hand the intentionality is sound, but it has led to sometimes at times problems as well. So I don't know if that answers that question helpfully or not.
Yeah, I think it's a good, a truthful, I appreciate response, to say it is uh yeah, an ever evolving thing that you're still playing with. I imagine there's
Yeah.
no one out there in the world that could say, oh well, here is the right way to, approach these things
No.
definitively. I'm 100% sure, and if they said that, I'd think they're wrong, like that
Yeah.
is something for people to play around with, and spend this time reflecting on. You talk about
Yeah.
patterns. I think that's so important too, because again, this real emphasis in CMM is to see yourself as a, what we call, curious participant, and to really
Yeah.
kind of step into that personal power that you have
Yeah.
to affect your social world. And at the same, this is my kind of, both and of what version of what you've just talked about. At the same time, how do you acknowledge all the things you can't control? And so, yeah,
Mm,
really sit in that complexity, I guess. But if I
mm,
really do believe, if you can see yourself, believe the story about yourself that says you're a active participant that has
yeah.
power,
Yeah.
then that's where those patterns can change, because you can show up differently.
Mm, yeah.
um and again, maybe that is still it's not to say, oh, I'm going to show up differently. You decide that one day and then you start showing up differently and
Yeah.
everything's better. It
Yeah.
is this
Yeah.
complexity, and that's what I'm appreciating that you're speaking to, that because I hate so much when people say, everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And yet, I recognize a kind of deeper negative truth maybe people are trying to get to at that I think you're getting to, which is I can sit in this knowledge that both these things that happened to me were bad, wrong, traumatizing, hurtful, and also who I am today because of them. And
Yeah.
see the role that they play in your story without
Yeah.
diminishing the pain or the struggle that went with
Yeah.
them. Again, this both
Yeah.
and idea does feel so important to me.
Yeah.
And it's a practice, I think, to develop a both and way of thinking,
Yeah.
especially if you grew up in kind of maybe a oversimplified with an oversimplified perspective that was, okay,
Yeah.
right and wrong and good and
Yeah.
bad, and this,
Yeah. That
everything's very
kind of
simple.
dry. Yeah.
Right. So that both and is a practice in expanding your meaning, and, making meaning practice is how I see it.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's interesting. And I think, again, I know and appreciate that the journey that other, senior leaders have taken will be unique to them, some less arduous than others. And one can argue about the challenges of that. And that would be right to talk about, how do we create many, as you say, many stories, many examples, many opportunities so that those experiences become lessened. um, but there's also something for me about I wouldn't, in some way, I wouldn't be who I am without some of that, and
Right.
that's important for me because it means it gives me an opportunity to give voice to maybe voices that are not so prevalent there in those spaces, and to advocate and to think in a different way. Um, to others who haven't had that experience, which is the nature of life, isn't it? If you
Yeah.
haven't had an experience, then you're less likely to draw on it or use it. And so I think it's about how do you use what you have, regardless of how you got it, but how do you use it? How do you use it for the greater good and for in service to others? And I think that's where I'm at the moment.
That's a great place to be. I'm glad to hear it, that you're in it and doing the work and the thinking. And
Yeah,
glad we have people like you out there, Nana, who are committed to
thank
this work
you.
and feel passionate and hopeful and are telling new stories. I think it's really so important and meaningful. I broad question, but at the end, I just want to give a chance. Is there anything else that you want to share that we didn't get to talk about today yet?
No, I think, like, being in this role when this is published, I'll be in Camden. And as I said, thinking about that whole kind of civic imagination
Hmm.
and thinking about how the relationship that individuals have with the state and the experiences that individuals have with the state, how do we do that with love and humanity and respect? And that's what I'm going to be really keen on. Yeah, bringing all of that to that kind of way of thinking, redesigning, rethinking, reshaping, redeveloping, and keep on pushing, pushing, and pushing.
Yeah, that's the question. That yep. Well, thank you so much, Nana.
Thank you, Abby. I appreciate it.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Nana. At the end of each episode, I like to offer a question to reflect on, which acts as a next turn, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the question I would have you think about is, where in your life are you living or telling a singular story? And how can you make space to explore more stories for yourself and others? This goes back to something that Nana and I spoke about early on in this conversation, but I think it's so central. So that's what I would have you think about as you reflect on this conversation. As always, you can reach out to me to share your reflections on this question, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that in a couple ways: through email, the website, by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or by commenting on the Substack. Links to all those places can be found in the show notes. And the reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. And like I mentioned at the top of the episode, take a moment to fill out that short survey and help me decide the course of this podcast for the future. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to empower us in our communication that we might create better social worlds out of it. Other initiatives of the CMM Institute that I'll point you towards are our new Substack. It's a great home for all our resources. So whether you are teaching CMM or still just trying to build your own understanding around CMM, those are some great, really accessible resources, all available for free. We also have the Cosmo Activities line of social emotional resources, also available for free. Those are just two of a lot of initiatives we have. So again, link in the show notes. I'd invite you to check out all of that. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.